Well, here we are on Finnmark Sauna, the Sauna Twins of Finnmark Sauna's inaugural podcast. We are very, very lucky to have Dr. Lassi Liikkanen of saunologia.fi with us today. So without ruining too much of the story, Al, as you're known, runs a blog which specializes in trying to understand how to build the perfect sauna. So tell us a little bit about how you started SaunaLogia and what it's about, and what people might expect if they were to go on there.
All right. Thank you for the invitation. I'm happy to be here. So as said, I started the saunologia.fi back in 2016 in February. I was at the time being, I was in the middle of a process of constructing my own outdoor sauna cabin, which is basically would be a kind of extension to my existing like summer home or kind of villa outside. So I'm basically based in Helsinki, Finland. Finland is the kind of ultimate mecca of the sauna culture, yes. Or at least all the Finnish people like to think so. And I had quite recently, before that, acquired with our family, we bought a new cabin, which was equipped with a sauna, though, but the sauna wasn't quite much to our liking. In fact, it was kind of very bad, in our opinion. And I thus decided that, okay, we could probably do some better with the sauna. And then somewhere in late 2015, started designing how to create a new one and a better sauna. Well, I've been personally using internet since for more than 20 years now, and whatever I'm kind of interested in, the first thing to do is to fire up Google and go look for information, whatever is the topic, and trying to follow this paradigm back in 2015. I tried to find some information about, well, how do you go about designing this kind of perfect Finnish sauna? Because I know that by my own experience, there were a lot of very bad examples of the Finnish sauna around, and I just happened to buy one of those now. So I definitely not want to kind of repeat those same mistakes that the previous designers had done. And using Google, found some information, didn't quite like what I found. Then I kind of decided that, I have to build a sauna anyway, so why not make this kind of a documentation project? Because doing this kind of documentation about design and how to do stuff was somewhat kind of natural for me. My background is I did a doctorate degree in engineering, and currently I have still like a relationship with the Finnish Aalto University in the human-centered design, being that professor over there. So I'm kind of been for quite a long time been interested about what sort of aspects make up for good user experience and good usability. How do good products look like, feel like? So I thought that it would be kind of an interesting expedition to figure out that what really makes up for a good Finnish sauna. And I was kind of very convinced at the time being that it shouldn't be that difficult to find the answer. Just ask the experts. Well, then I started doing both the design for the sauna in early 2016, and then also started documenting the things that I found. There was hardly anything to be found online at that time, really. But I then started digging up literature. I thought I would make some sort of like expert interviews, which are always the kind of easiest way to get to know things. How unfortunately it turned out that doing the expert interviews was really not that easy. The first interview I did was with this guy called Risto Vuola-Apiala. He's kind of a living legend inside Finland for his long extensive work on smoke saunas and their architecture. But he was kind of, he was expert on the smoke sauna thing, but he couldn't really provide the answers I was looking for. He provided few answers and left a lot of things still unsettled. So I started looking for further experts. But the thing was that I soon found out that the most of the people who'd been, for instance, contributing, we have in Finnish language, there's been quite a steady stream of books about saunas and sauna culture, sauna design from 1950s. But the people who had kind of most recently authored books about the Finnish sauna had all deceased within the past 10 years or so. So we had like people like Professor Erkki Helamaa, Pekka Tommila, who'd written several books both about the sauna stove and things like that. But unfortunately, they had all kind of passed quite recently, so it was impossible to find these kind of experts. So this basically meant that I had to kind of complete my own journey about kind of finishing up the designs for my personal sauna, and then kind of continue kind of digging up details about the Finnish sauna design along the way. And I think I already back in 2016 I had this kind of vision that I would use this blog type of publication, saunologia.fi, as an outlet to create this kind of electronic book about how you design a Finnish sauna.
I think it's an interesting challenge, and something we certainly faced with Finnmark Sauna was that there's such a huge amount of misinformation out there online, not least in what makes a proper Finnish sauna. So I've read things online where people have said, "Oh, a Finnish sauna is really, really hot and really, really dry," and actually, a lot of traditional Finnish saunas might be very, very humid, and certainly it depends on the user as to how they use it. Typically, I found that when female groups go to the sauna together in Finland, they have the temperature a little bit lower, but with a lot more steam, and then guys might go a bit later when it's a bit hotter. But you're completely right. It's refreshing for us to see somebody taking a scientific approach to analyzing a number of different traditional viewpoints. Like, I don't think there's one Finn in Finland that I've met that agrees on what is the way to build a sauna. Everyone has like a slightly different approach. I don't know whether it's like my grandma makes the best cake kind of thing. That my grandfather, he built a log sauna in the woods, and it's the perfect sauna steam, the perfect löyly, and so everybody has a slightly different view of what makes it perfect. But you'll tell us a little bit more about this, but what makes your blog really interesting is that you actually use a rigorous scientific method to a lot of the aspects of what makes a good sauna.
At least I try as far as possible. And you're right in saying that. I think if you go ask any Finnish person that what is their favorite or the best sauna they've ever been to, they usually nominate their own sauna. At least that's also what I do. But
I think we're guilty of that too.
But of course, there's if we look at the things from the Finnish perspective, because you have to kind of acknowledge that in Finland, which is a country of about like 5.5 million people, or almost 3 million saunas, we can find quite a big variety of saunas, but then again, we have some sort of like a shared, very like deep cultural understanding that what the Finnish sauna is all about. And kind of the central elements that go into Finnish sauna, I think, in my opinion, is that when you go to a Finnish sauna, you expect to find a place which has benches, which has a visible stove, which has visible stones. There's a ladle and pail which enable this kind of sauna democracy to happen, so that basically, at least in theory, anyone's entitled to pick up the ladle and throw some water on the stones. It's of course considered in kind of public sauna settings polite to ask everyone else in the sauna if it's okay to throw in more water on the stove, because of course that will kind of increase the feeling of heat, and some people might not want that at that particular moment or at all.
That was something I really, really admired. Last time I was in Finland, was in the Finnish Sauna Society. I hadn't come across this this kind of sauna culture before, this etiquette, but we were being guided by. He refers to himself as the sauna Sherpa, but his name's Kimo, and. He told us that, as you leave the room as well, you must turn and ask, does anyone want any more löyly before I leave? Because obviously, as you open the door, it releases a lot of heat. So there's quite a complex, deep, ritualistic aspect of sauna that is obviously so ingrained in second nature to the Finnish public.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. And although I have to say that in Finland, the preservation of the sauna etiquette has been quite exclusively constrained to this, like the Finnish Sauna Society, which has their kind of own sauna facilities, which of course make it easier to create your own culture there.
Okay, right.
Because in overall, we have given so many public saunas all around the place in Finland, and also the great number of private saunas that basically enables us to kind of spend most of their sauna time in private, which means that you don't really have to there's no need to have this kind of shared code, and therefore a lot of people never kind of exposed to this type of sauna etiquette that you have in this kind of high society sauna.
It's a shame because I really enjoyed it. I thought it was a heightened sense of community. So there's these Finnish men that I've never met before. Were all completely nude, and then all of a sudden, out from that comes conversation with someone who I would have just ignored at any other public sauna, because we had to interact because, as you say, it was the code. And I thought that was really nice aspect.
I've heard people liken the Finnish sauna experience to the great leveler. Like you could be sat next to a judge and a policeman and an army officer and a politician, and you wouldn't know because there's nothing that you can wear that differentiates yourself from everybody else. And politically speaking, there's obviously, you'll probably be able to clarify this story, but people talking about doing business in the sauna and politics in the sauna, that there's also something to be said for if you're somewhere that's really hot and humid and you're in a good place, but you're going through an experience which requires some endurance, then it's very difficult for you to be flowery with your words or potentially tell some kind of long-winded story, much like I am now.
It puts its time pressure.
Yeah, you kind of have to say it in the most brass tacks, like direct way that you can. So, I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Well, I think, first of all, Finland and few of its former leaders have been known for this kind of sauna diplomacy, particularly the president, very long-term president, Urho Kekkonen, who was in office for way too long. He was very well known for the fact that he had this kind of, he had like several, what you'd call, we had this, you'd call it something like luxury sauna or like a sauna for VIPs, quite close to the center of Helsinki, where he used to take in international guests, and including, for instance, a lot of the old Soviet heads of state like Nikita Khrushchev, and apparently also he managed to actually sell a sauna stove to him. The Aito Kiwas, one of the Aito Kiwas' first deliveries went to Nikita.
I should clarify that the Aito Kiwas is like the Aito meaning genuine and Kiwas meaning stove, so genuine sauna stove, and it comes from the old, more traditional sauna setups. It looks like a enameled black barrel to anybody who's not seen these before. And what they lack in beauty, they very much make up for in the experience, the steam or the löyly of the sauna.
Well, you'd say that they have a pretty classic design because the stove was designed somewhere in like late 1940s, and it first appeared in something like 1952 around Finnish Olympics in Helsinki. But yeah, coming back to this leveling aspect, I think then again, the kind of how this President Kekkonen used the sauna was not necessarily the idea was not that it was necessarily that equalizing. He was very well known for his preference for extremely hard and hot sauna experiences. So he basically also was probably kind of a little bit showing off his.
It was very strategic.
Yeah. So you can actually find still online the video clips from like late 70s, where he basically kind of there's this saying like putting everyone else out of the sauna for putting that much water on the stove. And then he remains there whisking himself and saying that now the proper sauna starts when everyone else has been forced to leave.
Yeah.
But I think, well, that's actually, this. So to some extent, this works. But I think nowadays the kind of importance of sauna in Finnish business making has maybe reduced and there's a few reasons for that.
Mm-hmm.
One of them probably being the fact that first of all, people have unfortunately maybe a little less time to do this kind of activities, although people do golf, so I'm sure that kind of makes sense. But maybe the more important reason is that we still in Finland have very kind of clear sex segregation in saunas.
Yeah.
And as the amount of women in
business,
politics and business has been increasing, it doesn't kind of work anymore in the same way when, like back in the days when the guys were making all the decisions and doing all the business. So it's these kind of movements have been going on, but I think as I mentioned the President Kekkonen. I think the President Kekkonen is a good example of all kind of the basic things that you're expecting in the Finnish sauna, or what kind of I think kind of define the Finnish sauna. We actually went this. There's actually like a photo or picture from the SaunaLogia website, which we could pull up.
Can we get that up? Cheers.
As kind of a good reference to things that kind of identify the Finnish sauna.
There we go.
So here's a kind of very basic illustration of the kind of main elements that you expect to see when we're talking about Finnish sauna. I said there are benches, there are stones, there's stove, and there's steam. The steam is the kind of essence of the Finnish sauna experience, really.
Which is the löyly.
The löyly, löyly, which is generated by pouring some water on the hot stones.
Yeah. And for those of you who've only read this word before, it's L-O with an umlaut, Y-L-Y. So if you were to read it, as an English person, you might call it loily, but it's pronounced löyly. Is that right?
Yeah, löyly. Yeah, that's how you're supposed to say it. I'm not personally that kind of particular whether how you want to pronounce this sauna or löyly. As long as you are able to enjoy the experience you get out of it, regardless of how you say things. But I think this is the kind of essence. If you kind of compare the different kind of saunas around the world and people's perceptions of sauna, the kind of possibility to create the steam, make löyly happen, is the kind of the important thing about the Finnish sauna. This means that we can, for instance, hide away the stove, which would make it impossible to create löyly. We can't hide away. We can't prevent people from having their the pail and ladle in order to create the steam. It's supposed to be that everyone can do that. It's not in Finnish culture. It's not reserved to the any kind of sauna maestro or meister who's supposed to take care of everyone takes care of it.
Yeah, I should clarify as well. In Germany, they have these sauna meister rituals where or sauna master where almost typically German at time intervals, so every half an hour in a different sauna in an establishment, there will be a guy who comes in, who pours water on, and they often use sauna scents. So, they might say, oh, today's sauna has watermelon scent in it. And then they use like towels or these big fans to fan heat and steam over. And it's also a bit of an endurance thing as well, I think, because once everybody's in there, they all feel like, okay, I have to sit this out. And, I'm a frequent sauna user, and I've been in a few of these where like I'm sitting there going, I really got to get out of here, but I can't be the one to leave. And then there's all these like people, like particularly if you go in there and you go and sit on the top bench, if it's one of these big German saunas where they got like 4 tiers of benching, go and sit right on the top bench, like, yeah, I do this all the time. And then they're just there with this big fan, like blowing hot air at you. And if anybody's ever like blown gently on somebody in the sauna, they'll know that it just makes it insanely hot. So using a big fan or a towel will make it really hot for you. And they do things like they might give you some honey to rub on your skin or some fruit to eat.
Yeah, there's all kinds of funny stuff that goes in the Central European thing.
Yeah.
I think in Finland, partially due to the fact that we've got a lot of like private saunas, the Finnish sauna culture and sauna habits have developed into, I'd say, like relatively moderate or kind of easy decision or easy direction in a way that I've recently been writing a book which is supposed to be coming out very soon in Finland.
We have it here.
Yeah, there's something on display already in advance, and in which I'm basically like calling that the löyly is like the obedient servant of the Finnish sauna goer. In a way that we basically expect that it does its works, and we just kind of sit around and wait for things to happen. And we, in the worst case, we might be able to require to do the pouring of the water, but that's all. And then we just kind of sit and enjoy the results. Mm-hmm. Whereas, as you've described, things happen in other like big places where there are saunas, like in Germany or in Russia. People behave with löyly a little bit differently.
Yeah, so bringing it back to the SaunaLogia page just here that we've got up, the benches are a critical aspect of the sauna design, what makes the Finnish sauna, and I'm just wondering whether you can talk us through the really critical points in bench configuration or design, which is important for the experience in the sauna.
Yes, certainly. I think if we can think about the benches, we can think about the kind of old history of the Finnish sauna design, because the Finnish sauna has been around for longer in history that anyone can recall.
I think that some people argue it's been about since the Neolithic, with like sweat lodge tents, or particularly when you look at cultures like the Sami migratory herds.
Actually, the Sami people haven't, the kind of Nordic tribes haven't really been using the sauna at all. That's kind of interesting. But the Finland has been kind of intersection of the east and west, and particularly people mostly expect that the kind of the first origins of the sauna culture have arrived from the Russian direction, from the east. So anyhow, it kind of goes like the history of the word itself. The sauna goes back about at least 1,000, maybe 2,000 years. Anyhow, one of the kind of important things about the Finnish sauna construction, however far in the past and you look, is to understand the kind of basic principles of physics that govern how the saunas work. And there we have, you can kind of, if you kind of imagine the most simple kind of sauna possible, is that would be some sort of like if you set up a fireplace, just throw up a pile of wood and start burning it. When to put some stones in it, in the final stage is to heat up the stones, and then you kind of build some kind of tent around it. That's basically already might classify as some sort of like nomadic makeshift sauna. The important thing is that you got some sort of like a cover around this heater thing, the stove or the pile of rocks. And one thing that everyone kind of immediately understands is that the heat is always kind of going upwards. The heat and humidity rise above the kind of colder air, and therefore, if you kind of create this kind of specific enclosed space like the sauna room, what you're going to need is that you want to elevate the people as close as possible to the ceiling, because the ceiling is the place where all the heat is. I mean, you can achieve pretty much equal temperature in the room from the ceiling to the floor, but that takes quite a long time. Yeah. So if you are kind of doing this relatively short-lived sauna experience, you might want to make sure that everyone has quite a good reach to the highest part of the space that is being heated up. So and therefore you need the benches.
On your diagram here, is it erroneous that you've put a pitched roof there? Because
yeah, that's actually that's kind of like a bad illustration from my part. I actually had
sorry.
On the website you'll find another article about the sauna roofs.
Yeah.
Which basically shows you how you're supposed to do that, and actually that kind of model, like we have that pitched roof, is mentioned as one of the bad examples of how you're not supposed to do that. In principle, that can also work out, particularly if it's not that if the angle is not like
Really
if
steep.
it's like this.
Yeah.
And actually, the very good model for sauna roof is if you kind of build this kind of rounded dome shape.
Okay.
Because one of the actions in the Finnish sauna that inner roof has is that it kind of guides the steam to go around. So actually, you get the best possible experience if you have like absolutely rounded shape, which that it allows the steam to kind of mix and move around very freely. So that would be the kind of ideal.
I didn't know that.
Sauna shape. Yeah. Of course, it's kind of difficult to achieve with wooden construction. Much easier if you do like concrete or something else. But you can kind of approximate it, and it's not really kind of the differences in that bad. But I think in wooden construction, the kind of traditional, very good model is where you have like two folded format. We can at some point have a look at it from on the website as well. But so if we kind of think about the kind of important things about the sauna, in my book, I've basically divided the kind of essence of the Finnish sauna design into 4 different sections. And like these sections are the heat, air quality, sauna room structures, and then the 4th one is the sauna culture and habits. And I think the heat is really the kind of essence of the sauna. I mean, that's really something that everyone gets.
Yes.
That you need to have the heat.
Like the engine of the sound.
I also like the kind of metaphor of talking about the sauna stove as the engine of the sauna, and then the sauna stove as kind of engine oil.
Okay.
Well, we could actually pull up another picture. There's I've got a pretty good collection of different type of sauna-related imagery on Pinterest. Here's a Pinterest board, which should be actually, this is lacking the English title. I should probably tweak it a little bit. It's supposed to be like the Finnish sauna stoves.
Okay.
Basically, here we have a pretty good collection of different kind of photos that illustrate the variety of sauna stoves that we have on market in Finland. You can freely scroll it downwards. We have a lot of different kind of varieties on the market nowadays, and so the sauna stove is something that has been commercialized in Finland in the 1950s, and we still have on the market more than 20 different companies, almost 30 brands of stoves. So you can find all kinds of designs, and overall, I think customers in Finland and around the world have really benefited hugely from the kind of some design efforts that people have been putting into making the stoves look a little bit more modern, at least on the outside. But as said, the sauna stove has several important properties in order to kind of be functional within the space. I think the most important of them all is that it has to be appropriately effective in terms of the heat power output. So you basically need to match the size of the room with the size of the stove and power of it. There are a lot of things that kind of influence this, but any kind of retailer who understands anything about the stoves should get this thing right. That's kind of easy part of the math.
Yeah,
but that's actually not enough. As we can see that all the Finnish stoves have, actually some of the stoves like we're still looking here. Few of the stoves which have this kind of concealed space for stones. You don't actually see the stones, but they still exist inside this inside the stove.
So the 3 examples you got there was the Steam Ready,
the Steam Master,
and there's also an Aito QoS in the middle there, right?
Yeah. So these are the kind of there are like a lot of variations of how you can kind of have this stone mass, and the stone mass is kind of important when we remember that one of the important qualities of the Finnish sauna is the ability to create löyly. And you can't really create löyly unless you have like some hot surface and hot and kind of stored heat, which can be used to evaporate water. And so basically we have like inside these stoves, we have few basic variations. Some of the variations are like we have like the most common variations of stones nowadays in Finland are such that They are so-called continuously heated, which basically means that if it's electric heaters or which are plugged into the electricity network, you turn the heater on and you keep it on as long as you use the sauna. Or if it's wood-fired, you basically are required you start heating it maybe 1 hour in advance. You put in more firewood, and once you keep on using the sauna, you put in more wood until you kind of decide to stop, and then you let it cool down.
Yeah, because the more traditional style of heaters, like we discussed earlier, for example, was the Aito QoS.
Yeah.
I didn't realize until I actually went and tried one in Finland that you heat up the stones and then put the fire out, and the stones stay hot for quite some time because it works like a big storage heater.
Yes. Yeah, that's the idea. That's like heat storage stove or single wood-fired stove, whatever you want to call it. Yeah, this is the kind of original idea. Particularly, the kind of first Finnish saunas were like this smoke sauna was the original Finnish sauna type, which basically meant when I previously made a metaphor of creating a small fire out of in woods. It was basically, you could say that it was basically the same thing, but you just had the fire inside a building, unconstrained. So you basically had all the smoke going around. Smoke went through the stones and then escaped from some small hatch somewhere inside the sauna building.
But not during use. We should clarify.
No, the fire goes out first.
When I talk about savu sauna or smoke sauna to English people, they're like, wouldn't you just suffocate in there? So we should clarify that.
Yeah, that is correct. I think although that's actually that wouldn't necessarily happen, which is kind of funny thing because people when they heat up the sauna, they managed to do that without suffocating. And actually, the Native Americans had this sweat lodge tradition in which they were actually burning the fire as they were in the lodge.
Yeah.
So it's possible to achieve this kind of effect as well, but it's definitely much more comfortable if you don't do that.
Yes,
and less risky.
Yeah,
but in order to achieve then this kind of proper sauna experience, with this type of stoves, the minimum requirement is that you need to have adequate capacity of kind of thermal storage mass, whether it's rocks inside the sauna stove or just the whole construction. The Aito QoS example, for which we are just here still looking at, is kind of combination of both. They have like internal mass out of like bricks, which store heat, and then the sauna stones themselves inside the stove. So. And if you want to try to do this, you of course need an appropriate number.
So there's a range of different stones that you can use in those heaters as well?
Yeah, certainly. I think I would like to say that in order to kind of achieve this kind of capacity to, for instance, to enjoy the sauna without heating it up, you need to kind of have the appropriate amount of energy stored. And in order to do that, there are basically just two things that you can change, or maybe like three things. First of all is to have enough big volume of the stones. Then you can change the kind of thermal capacity in the stones. And third, you can sometimes change the amount of heat or the amount of temperature that you heat the stones up to. And of course, the stones are kind of a visible thing, and as I compare them to the kind of engine oil in a car motor, that's kind of, I think the important part of this thing is that first of all, it means that it's kind of it's a moving part. It's part that kind of sustains stress, which means that it has to be replaced every now and then. But it also means that it's something that you can kind of experiment with if you feel that it's not performing like you want to. In Finland, we basically have been using different type of stones that we've been mining from the nature for a long time.
Yeah.
Before this was like the production of sauna rocks and stones became commercial business. People just picked up the stones from like beaches and seasides and rivers.
Yeah, I mean, I should make a comment about the US sauna culture briefly. That particularly the Upper Peninsula Michigan community, which has a sort of essentially it's the highest proportion of Finns out or genetic Finns outside Finland. A lot of the saunas I see built there using like a pioneer wood stove with like a handful of
Pebbles, or large pebbles.
large granite pebbles. Then that they're generally they seem to say that the pebbles from the shore of Lake Superior, which I believe now is frowned upon because there'll be no pebbles left for anybody. But from what I gather, they just have a few handful of those on like a wood burning stove. But that's granite, and having read your blog, I know what happens to granite if you use that. So I've always wondered.
Yeah, the granite is, of course, it's been very, it's popular rock in Finland. It's very easy to find, and it's not really suitable for sauna stoves. And that's the unfortunate thing. So even though people were kind of picking up this kind of stones that they were able to find, and sometimes maybe even doing some sort of rudimentary testing in order to figure out if it actually works for sauna. Nowadays, when we've basically been in this kind of more like commercially provided stones and stoves for several decades, we've basically been down to the fact that we had for a very long time, like since 1950s, we had this particular type of rock. This is like igneous rock or magmatic rock from the family of peridotite, yeah. This was very popular for a long time. In 1970s, this was almost exclusively used because it has several good properties. It's very effective in storing heat. Mm-hmm. It's also kind of conducts heat, which means that you can get quite a good löyly out of it because you get the energy inside the rock transmitted into the water quickly. But it also it's durable. You can kind of use it for quite a long time. It actually turns into being brown pretty quickly, but doesn't kind of affect it. It stays in one piece for a long period of time, and it was good. But unfortunately, mining it became kind of difficult over the time, and it was kind of a lot of the main sources were depleted. So people then switched to different solutions. Nowadays, the whole of Finland and the saunas are powered with this so-called olivine diabase rock, which is
olivine diabase in English.
Yeah. This is basically a little bit from the same family of stones, but has a little bit different properties. Most of all, it's not as good as the old one, but it's good enough, and it's available in different sizes, different forms, and particularly for very cheap. So no one in Finland should have any reason to not to replace their stones repeatedly and to use anything else. But this kind of commercially created rocks.
So did you say people have moved away from the peridotite because of scarcity, or is that
that's the biggest problem? That basically, well, I've got this very tiny sample with me, but the thing is that basically the only thing you can buy can't even get this from most of the stores, but in places where you can buy this. Supermarkets, the sizes aren't really suitable for anything else but the electric heaters.
Okay.
Because generally speaking, different type of sauna stoves call for a little bit different type of rocks. Basically, the bigger the stove, the bigger the stones.
I heard the big Aito Kioas 110, so the biggest size at the Finnish Sauna Society outside Helsinki, uses peridotite, but these stones were massive. They're really huge.
I think they have a secret quarry somewhere that nobody knows about.
Well, yeah, no, it's not that kind of a big secret where the rocks come from, but the supplier has kind of very limited capacity to produce anything, so I think they basically sell most of the stuff that they create for the Sauna Society. But yeah, if you just went there and asked to buy something, you'd probably get something in return if you have your own truck with you to transport the stones. But basically, the fact that the good old peridotite has been kind of vanishing, people have been coming up with different alternatives. One of them is so-called ceramic sauna stone.
Mm-hmm.
We've got basically 2 different varieties in Finland. This is the kind of more respectable one from a producer called Kerkes.
Mm-hmm.
And this has become very popular. This is basically like a ceramic material which can be made into various forms and shapes and sizes. This is kind of created in very high temperature, I think like 1,300 degrees, which basically means that it will withstand almost all imaginable sauna circumstances very well. Yeah. And the only problem is that it becomes pretty expensive because there are parts of the process which require hand manufacturing, and then a lot of energy gets used when it's being baked.
For people listening who can't see the example, it looks kind of like a potato with weird triangular indentations all over it.
Yeah, the indentations are actually part of the design, in a sense that they believe that
area.
They increase the surface area, and some people believe that it allows, because there's an important part of how the heating of the sauna works is that when you heat up, the heat is coming from the stove, and particularly in electric heaters, it's important that there's air flowing through the stove, because what happens is when you start heating something up, you create this kind of rising flow of air, a little bit like hot air balloons or whatever you want to think about it, this kind of uplift. And this means that inside the stove, there's always air moving quite quickly. And one of the things is that this kind of adding more surface, making this, this thing I'm holding in my hand could be perfectly rounded ball, but then it would have the minimal amount of surface. So this kind of basically creates more opportunities for this thing to heat up when it's inside the stove.
Mm-hmm.
So that kind of helps.
Okay.
The biggest downside is that it's, even though it might be like 10 times as more durable in some circumstances, it's not really forever, but it's at least 20 times as expensive as the olivine dye-base for the same weight.
Yeah.
And does it actually produce like a different feeling löyly?
Well, I think people have very strong opinions about the type of steam produced. For one, this doesn't really look too attractive in any way. This looks like potato, to say the least.
Yeah.
And so I think but what this has, if you think about the kind of objective properties that we can actually measure, these are more lightweight than natural stones. And the other thing is that they don't conduct heat quite as much as stones. So as a consequence, the steam might be a little bit different. It might be not that aggressive, which sometimes is good, sometimes is bad. But I think there's, in Finland, for instance, I personally then do a combination so that I'd be using these ceramic stones at the bottom of the stove in my wood-fired stove, which they are kind of enduring the most stress. Mm-hmm. And then I've basically piled them up and covered them with another stone, which I like. This is called vulcanite. Vulcanite, yeah. This is more like akin to the peridotite and quite durable. I like this. This is kind of the darkest stone that you can find on the market.
Yeah,
and it performs at least as well as the olivine dye-base. So it's kind of good choice, and it's not in Finland not more expensive either.
Yeah,
so it's good.
I did that last week for a good friend of ours in the British Sauna Society. We filled the well of the stone area in Kota with the Kerkes, and then top dressed it with olivine dye-base. And he remarked that the löyly felt really incredible. So is it something that you can blend different?
Yeah, there's no kind of rules against that. I mean, there are very few rules that would actually apply when doing sauna design, but few there are. But in the rocks, I think the most important thing is to keep them in good shape, because what will happen is that the natural stones will start disintegrating sooner or later, and they will kind of then crumble into smaller and smaller parts, and that's particularly problematic for the electric stoves, because it can lead to the destruction of the stove sooner or later. So
for longevity, you want to keep those stones changed. I must add as well, we're talking about like the nitty gritty of trying different sauna stones here, but as a general rule of thumb, one of the things I always say to people is that the more stones and the less metal, the better the steam.
Well, I think this kind of captures one of the myths that are being going around in Finland as well for quite a long time. But I personally don't kind of believe that this holds much true. If we kind of look at back for the Pinterest page that we had about the stoves, and then you can tell me that how many stoves can you see which don't have any metal to them?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I mean, we keep talking about it, but the Aito Kiowas is all metal.
Yeah, there's a lot of stones inside.
Yeah, there are.
Of course, I think to sort of clarify the point, if you're pouring water onto a stove and it's hitting metal, my general experience is that you get a much sharper hit of steam, and thus, and if you can get that water onto the stones, then that's a much more gentle, softer.
Okay, would I say that? I mean, there some people in Finland believe that there might be some sort of like a negative magical properties to iron, for instance, inside the stoves. Whereas, for instance, in Russia, it's not uncommon to find stoves that are basically equipped, instead of stones, they have iron.
Right. Okay.
And pieces of iron inside. But of course, the iron has very different qualities than typical stones. But I think you can get very good Finnish sauna experience when you use stones, but I wouldn't kind of disqualify a stove for the reason that it has some metal parts in it, because
they've all got metal.
It's kind of undeniable that you'll have hot metal parts as part of the stove, but it's better if you can cover them up with a lot of stones. Because the temperature differences, and as well because of course you will definitely get different type of löyly if you throw it on like hot iron instead of the rock, for several reasons. So I kind of agree with you, but I wouldn't be kind of superstitious about avoiding.
Sure. I mean,
metal.
It's certainly true that unless you go for like a smoke sauna, then you can't get away from there being metal on the stove. And pretty much every heater that's installed these days is metal. But I was talking a bit more about the ratio between, generally speaking, you find essentially around the stone cage, particularly those heaters that have less chance of the water having that direct contact with the metal. What I kind of liken it to, from my perspective as a sauna steam, is when I get water onto the metal directly, it's a lot sharper, faster heat, a hit of steam, because that water hitting the metal, that like instantly boils off. Whereas when you're pouring the water over the stones, then the steam builds much more gradually, and therefore it's not sharp.
I mean, that's totally true. So if you have like a chance of like choosing between two otherwise similar stoves, that might be a concern. But otherwise, I wouldn't kind of rank that very high as a kind of property of the stove, because I think that there's one interesting part which I've become aware quite recently, is that if you have a stove which has very like a tall space and volume for the rocks,
like a tower heater,
maybe more enclosed than the tower heater, but anyways, if you kind of very slowly pour down the water, so it kind of goes down lower parts of the stove, you basically, when the steam when the water evaporates in the lower parts of the rock space, it basically has more chances to gather additional heat when it goes around the stones. So you basically might actually get more like heat out of the same steam if you manage to generate the steam by pouring it like lower inside the stove. And they actually used to be there's an actually photo of this one particular stove called Aurinkokiuas or sun stove.
Okay.
It's not anymore. It's pretty tall stove. We could scroll downwards maybe on this page. I think it's actually there in the middle, a little bit back upwards. Yeah, there in the middle column. That one we can see it's got a pretty huge
tall door on the firebox.
Yeah, and I think they had incorporated this kind of, it still exists in some Russian stove designs. There's kind of like a channel inside the stove which leads the water into the middle part of the stove.
So we've recently come across a little gadget called the Horu Löyly.
Oh yeah. I've also tested that one. These guys have been very excellent in marketing the idea, but I don't think once more it makes a difference. But the difference is, I think, unfortunately, a little bit too small in most circumstances to make any.
Okay.
That's
but it follows that principle, though.
Yeah. That's the principle is the same. Yeah,
lowering the heater.
I don't kind of disagree with the basic principles, but the device is just far too small in order to be effective.
Mm-hmm. Okay, but you can do so. Various Finns have told me the slow pour method. But anyone who doesn't have a specific device or something that can deliver the water deep in the stones, if you just pour a ladle really slowly in the same location, the idea being that the surface stones cool down and allow the water to trickle deeper and deeper into the stove until it gets right down to the stones, like you're saying.
Yeah.
It gives you a good hit of steam.
Yeah, that's really nice.
Yeah. But I think now that we've kind of started following the steam, I think we could move forward a little bit in the discussion in terms that, I said in my book, I was basically starting from the heat, which we get out of the stove, but it doesn't kind of end there. The steam is actually an important part in dealing with the second big factor, which is the air quality. Because, as I'm saying that the creation of the steam löyly is integral part of the Finnish sauna tradition, and it does several kind of things happen when you create löyly. The löyly creates this kind of feeling of increased heat, and I'm not going to go to details of the physics behind this phenomenon, but everyone who's experienced it knows that it's true for several reasons. One of the reasons that's not, I'd say, it feels like the temperature of the sauna is rising, but in fact the temperature stays almost the same. But instead, the fact that we've, when we boil water in a kettle, for instance, we basically need to consume some amount of electricity or gas in order to do that. That's kind of energy that goes into vaporizing the water. And when we do that in sauna, and then we go on the sauna bench, suddenly there's water on our skin, which we usually interpret as being a sweat, but in fact, only probably half of the water that appears on our skin is actually sweat. The rest is actually the same water that we just poured on the stove, which starts to condensate on our skin. And this condensation process basically delivers the same energy that it draws from the stove and releases on our skin, which makes it kind of prickle and heat up our skin. And it also kind of heats up, for instance, wooden surfaces, which have this kind of hydro something properties.
Okay.
Basically, the wooden surfaces also absorb water to some extent and heat up in a similar kind of way. And so that's an important part that happens. But also a few other things happen. Besides the feeling of heat, we also get additional like convection, which basically means that the circulation of air inside the sauna room accelerates because when the water evaporates and we have löyly, it basically means that for instance, if we pour 1 liter of water, which is quite a lot, we get approximately 1 cubic meter
one cubic meter of
steam.
Yeah.
And that means that there will be that kind of drives the existing air to escape the sauna room if it can. Sometimes you might even, if you have like a loosely hatched door, the door might open. These are all kind of signs that there's something happening in the air temporarily. And so one part of why you feel more hot with the steam is the fact that the air started going more quicker around. There's this kind of temporal like wind almost. Like you said, if someone blows to your ear when you're in a sauna, you'll definitely feel it.
Yeah.
So it's a little bit similar kind of kissing happens with löyly. But so löyly is actually kind of one part of achieving good air quality in sauna, but unfortunately, it's not really enough. You can think about that sauna. You guys here at Finnmark have been making sure that the UK saunas would also be properly insulated and sealed and vapor barrierized.
Yes.
And that's all.
Ventilation is.
Yeah, that's fine and dandy, but you can kind of imagine that if one pulls like a plastic bag on your head and start breathing, you will be feeling very uncomfortable very quickly. And basically, if you create this kind of a sauna, particularly if it's a relatively small one, say like under 10 cubic meters, it's not that much space to live in for a very long time, particularly if it is shared by several people. So basically, you can't really have this kind of plastic bag feeling inside the sauna. Instead, you need to have some sort of like ventilation. You have to have like air moving in and out of sauna frequently. In Finland, we've had some sort of tries to define how much that would be. The kind of official regulations that we've had in the past have had stated very different figures. I'd say that from practice we can tell that we'd probably need to be able to change the air inside the sauna at least 2 or 3 times an hour, maybe even more. But then again, it's so that the absolute amount of air that goes in and out of sauna is not enough to describe how things go, because you can basically have one hole for the air coming in and the other hole for it going out. If it just directly passes by, it's not good.
Yeah, so with regard to ventilation, to what extent does the location affect the air quality, as you were saying?
Well, the location, it's kind of important. I'd rather say that the most important thing is the consequence of the location, in the sense that what we are looking forward to have is the right mixing of the fresh air with the existing air. And of course, then that we are kind of taking out the old air or the bad air from the right location. Because there are a few things that can and quite frequently go wrong with this thing. First of all, if we think about the outgoing air, I've seen too many examples in Finland of this kind of ventilation systems where you might have this kind of outgoing vent somewhere high up in the ceiling. And in the worst case, what happens is that, like I had in one of our own apartment buildings, we had a sauna which there was a very the level of ventilation, this kind of mechanical ventilation was very high. The volume was excessive. And there was like one huge outgoing vent just in the ceiling, and it always sucked immediately all löyly out of the room. So it was impossible to get any löyly there.
Yeah.
So even though on paper it might have looked that everything is okay because the number of or the amount of ventilation was at least adequate, let's say excessive. It was up to me. But the location was extremely bad.
Yeah.
That's not to say that at some point it might be actually useful to have this kind of vent up high in the ceiling.
We often call that like a drying vent, or a dump vent. So after use, you can open it up so that you can dry off all the benching and make sure that lasts as long as possible.
Yeah, I think that's very important, partly in wood-fired saunas, also in saunas which have this kind of natural ventilation. Because there are like two principally very different solutions for achieving the good air quality. about the mechanical ventilation and the natural ventilation. The natural ventilation is kind of a little bit more trickier. In Finland, we've basically even have like quite credible scientific research made out of the mechanical ventilation, but the natural ventilation is more or less a mystery and very commonly not that well understood or implemented. So when I do kind of in Finland give out advice about how to create ventilation, most of the questions usually concern natural ventilation, which is so much more easy to kind of screw up.
Yeah.
One of the things is that it's because it's invisible thing. You don't really kind of see if it works or if it doesn't work. You can have the holes in the wall as many as you like, but you can't really kind of. It's not that kind of straightforward to say that if they're going to do the job or not. So I basically, for my book, I made a small collection about like 4 or 5 different kind of solutions that you might have in order to kind of create a good, well-functioning natural ventilation. Because it has, particularly if you have this kind of wood-burning stove, which is kind of continuously fired, so using it while you're heating the sauna all the time while you're using it, it basically provides very good basis for having excellent ventilation, because the sauna stove itself, it consumes, in order to burn 1 kilogram of firewood, you basically need about 10 cubic meters worth of air.
Okay.
And that's already quite a lot. If you kind of think about it, depending on the size of the room, people know in typical
be all the air in the sauna.
Yeah, you usually consume in an hour almost 10 kilos of firewood. That means like 100 cubic meters of air has to go through.
Yeah.
The stove. So if you kind of then configure the inlets properly, it's a very easy way to achieve good quality in the sauna. But if you don't do that properly, it basically all goes to waste because it doesn't there are no guarantees that it will automatically succeed.
Yes.
And unfortunately, a lot of people in Finland have also been struggling with this. But in short, the air quality is something that you can achieve with good ventilation design. It's absolutely necessary in order to create an enjoyable sauna experience.
Yeah. Which is, I mean, we see it a lot, and I'm sure we could take you to some saunas in the UK here, which won't have any ventilation. And I've certainly been out to sites where they even blocked the gap under the door with a piece of like plastic. And I was like, why have you done that? And they said, oh, the users were complaining that there was too much air coming in through this gap. And I was like, oh my goodness, and it was a public sauna. So yeah, in the worst cases we've seen where I
had to remove one recently. And whilst removing the sauna, I came across the ventilation hole underneath the benches, and I thought, oh, great, there's someone else in England who's actually doing ventilation. And I opened the sluice, the vent, and directly behind it was a block wall. It went nowhere.
Just cosmetic ventilation. So it's like, oh well, this is how it should look, So no, and it's like with the heat. It's one of those things that it's really difficult for me to communicate to somebody, particularly somebody who is speculative in their interest of Finnish sauna, i.e. they've heard about it, they like the idea of it, they've maybe tried 1 or 2, so they don't really have a connoisseur's appreciation of what a good sauna experience maybe is. And they have to take my word for it when I say, look, you want to make sure this is properly ventilated. You want to make sure that you've got, most of the heaters will tell you how much fresh air per hour they need. And so the idea of an unventilated sauna is not just an unpleasant experience to sit in because it will just feel really stuffy, but also it's not very safe because, you also need fresh air.
Yeah, I think the existence of a good air quality based on ventilation is absolutely necessary in order to have an enjoyable sauna experience. I personally take the kind of number one measure of good sauna is duration of how long you can actually stay in there.
Yeah.
Of course, there are kind of a lot of personal preferences in terms of how kind of what sort of temperatures and how much humidity people can stand and so forth. But I think it's very bad sign if you have to kind of leave the sauna, which has relatively low temperature after 1 or 2 minutes. Then you know that there's something wrong with it.
Yeah.
Because if the air quality is good, people can usually sustain even pretty high temperatures for a long period of time.
Yeah.
But it's definitely a crucial matter for kind of.
What is a telltale sign if someone sat in a sauna and they don't know what they're looking for? What's a telltale sign in the way that they're feeling in terms of whether it's a good ventilation or bad ventilation?
Well, I think, as said, like a good sign about good ventilation and everything else being in quite good shape is the fact that you can, it feels good, that you can actually stay there for a long period of time. Because it's, of course, things, if you have never been to a sauna, it probably is somewhat shocking experience whether the sauna is objectively speaking good or bad when you go there first time. But if you have had any kind of a prior exposure to sauna, I think you'll pretty quickly figure out that if it's kind of comfortable or not.
I mean, it's no secret from us that our own sort of sauna enlightenment. Prior to that, what we tried in the UK, I mean, currently a lot of people's experience of sauna is like something that they go to tolerate for 10 minutes maybe after a workout in a gym, and they consume it like Victorians would consume medicine. Like, I'm sitting here because I know this is good for me, but I don't enjoy this at all. And I think that's such a shame, because when we tried proper sauna in Finland, it was like, whoa, I can stay in here 30 minutes and be like, and go between a cold plunge and then back in, and I can enjoy this whole experience over over a series of hours. And then afterwards, I mean, people talk about the euphoria and the sort of the serotonin hit, and certainly from a medical perspective, this kind of like huge boost in your immune system. There's, your body chemistry kind of goes crazy after you've had a really good sauna experience. And it's such a shame, because that's clearly what all this health hype is about. And sadly, like, people are kind of dosing themselves on unpleasant sauna experiences because they don't know any different. And because they don't know any different, the market kind of doesn't demand that. I often sort of liken it to kind of being a bit nauseous, like if you go into this sauna and it's like so dry that when you're breathing, you're having to humidify the air with your own breath, and there's no vents in, that you kind of start to feel this kind of sickness. And then that's...
Yeah, well, there's of course, there are different aspects also to why you get this kind of issues. One of them being the fact that if you kind of heat up a sauna, for like electric saunas can be very easily heated up for, say, 24/7. It'll basically create a dry environment that is very difficult to kind of achieve very nice level of humidity.
Yeah.
Or it becomes easily kind of excessive.
Yeah.
Because the more you raise the temperature, the more the higher absolute quantity of water you need to use in order to achieve similar kind of relative humidity.
Yeah.
So it becomes a little bit difficult. Yeah. So I think we could have a quick look at this picture from one of the few very credible studies in Finland done around the air quality thing and ventilation. This basically shows you how you could do things right if you are building something which has mechanical ventilation. Basically, the principle is pretty simple. You have, like in this simplified version, you basically have one inlet, which is located above the stove. And then you have one outlet, which is located approximately on the level of the lowest bench, or this kind of feet level benches. What this will create is that this ventilation guarantees that the incoming fresh air will be mixed with the existing air. And it also kind of draws the fact that there's the outlet is in quite low level. It basically means that it's sucking in the air from the upper parts lower, which makes the temperature gradient in the sauna also more favorable. Because, for instance, if you reverse this setup and have the inlet air in the floor and the outgoing in the ceiling, you basically get the warm region only in very high above in the sauna. So in this case, this kind of a combination both makes the heat very nice, and it also kind of gives you fresh air.
So that's a mechanical ventilation setup.
Yeah,
so
this is mechanical ventilation.
This is forced air in and forced air out.
Yeah, and this is actually in Finland. This is something that we would recommend if you're building your sauna in a part of your apartment, because the issues with having kind of natural ventilation, particularly inside a residential building, is that it's very difficult to guarantee that you'll be able to kind of get rid of all the humidity afterwards, which will then create all kinds of problems, and you don't really want to have to deal with that.
Yeah.
So if your house is equipped with mechanical ventilation, make sure that you actually plug your sauna into the same system as well.
Yeah.
Yes. Is it also, sorry, I digress slightly, but is it coincidence that in this image, it seems to be quite good at representing the law of löyly?
Yeah. This is actually for some reason. This is it happens to be also a nice illustration of the law of löyly, which basically it's not the law. The law of löyly was originally described by this Finnish. I don't know. You'd call him maybe anthropologist or kind of a scientist, but he was basically he wrote a very I'd say funny book about the sauna cultures inside Finland and also outside in the world, and it wasn't supposed to be taken very seriously, but the law of löyly still persists, and basically it says one thing, and the one thing is that when you're sitting in sauna, you should have all the sauna stoves beneath the level of your toes.
Mm-hmm.
And that's
so the top edge of the heater should be lower than the top of the lower bench.
Yes, yes, that is correct. And actually, some people like to say that it would probably be preferable if you even had the lower bench maybe like 10 centimeters higher than the rock level. Now, this law of löyly seems to apply mostly in the occasions where you have natural ventilation, because it's not really kind of exactly a description of physics how things go, because if you kind of heat up the sauna for a very long period of time, particularly if you have mechanical ventilation, the sauna will heat up quite evenly from very low parts to the bottom. And actually, there's one very interesting variation in Finland, which is called like air circulation sauna, in which the idea is that you place this kind of air sucking outlet directly above the stove, and then you kind of capture the steam, and then you redirect the steam to the lower part of the sauna where it kind of then goes up. You do this kind of underneath. You basically build channels behind the sauna paneling to do this funny circulation thing. That allows you to kind of achieve almost like 95% of the sauna will have identical circumstances for having steam and löyly. It's a little bit expensive to kind of create, but it's also basically one of the best ways to build this kind of wheelchair accessible sauna, because it leaves only about like 2 or 3 inches from the bottom from the floor colder than rest of the sauna, and you'll basically have some kind of löyly experience all through the room without creating having to even create benches. So basically the law of löyly is very good principle when you are building say like a simple wood-fired sauna backyard or at your cabin, but it doesn't kind of strictly apply in other circumstances. But if we kind of think about, we can now move on to the third part. In my book, my third section of my book concerns basically all the structures that you have inside a sauna room. And the most important structures are actually already somewhat discussed, and they are visible in this photo as well. And they are the benches and the ceiling. It's kind of funny that both of these elements actually play a role in how things in the sauna will feel. Of course, particularly the benches are probably the thing that I'd make most prominent. We could actually have a look at Pinterest once more. There's a Pinterest board called Sauna Benches, SaunaLED, which we can find, which has a lot of different kind of illustrations for different types of sauna benches. I'm sure if
it might be a pin on a Pinterest board if you go back.
Yeah, it's under the Pinterest board under the saunologia. Go one more back
again.
So you're on. Yeah, now we should be able to find something that looks like benches. There it is. SaunaLED. That one. Yeah. So sauna benches it's like crucial thing in a normally operating sauna, because we have to have this kind of elevation in order to be in the place where the steam goes. And it also it's kind of like a good the sauna benches is also an opportunity to provide a little bit different kind of sauna environment across the sauna room. There are a lot of different kind of variations of how you can achieve this, and of course the sauna benches are very central to the aesthetics of the whole sauna room, because you can do them in so many different kind of ways, but they will almost always dominate how the thing will look like eventually. In Finland, you can find a lot of different kind of designs, and if you can kind of look internationally, you'll find even more examples. In Finland, we basically have very few basic variations, which usually occupy at least one side of the floor. Nowadays, in past 10-15 years in Finland, we've got the models that have basically cover almost all of the sauna area have become very popular. But so there are the kind of alternatives are just numerous. There are a lot of materials that you can use, but I think I personally kind of the important stuff about the sauna benches is the relative height. We've already discussed the law of löyly, but the kind of most the key figure, the number one thing is to take into consideration that what is the height from the ceiling to the uppermost bench. Because if you have like too high ceiling relatively to the high bench, you're basically never going to get löyly, and it's going to be very energy inefficient of heating up the whole space. So I also have somewhere we're not going to look at that, but there are examples in a board called Saunas Designed to Fail, in which I've collected a few examples of saunas which have like benches on the very low level, and then you have like a ceiling going high up.
Yeah,
because it's basically what's called folding to the wrong direction.
Yeah.
So it would be technically or physically impossible to get any steam in that kind of sauna. Yeah. So the distance between the benches and the ceiling is the most important thing for the functional thing. Of course, you also have to take into consideration material. In Finland, people use wood. Wood is good because it works as kind of insulation. It doesn't conduct heat very quickly. If you try to build, there's kind of an old legend about that the Russian people wanted to have, as a war compensation after Second World War, they ordered benches made out of copper. I don't think that's a legend, because I think at some point Finnish people didn't believe that Russians know anything about sauna. That was not really correct. But all kind of wooden materials are pretty good for sauna benches. Of course, there are a lot of they've got many dimensions. But important thing is that you should be able to kind of rest on the sauna benches comfortably, which means you need some sort of dimensions depending on what you want to lie down on your back. If you want to kind of be sitting there comfortably, then it's the kind of basic dimensions, how many people you're trying to fit in. In Finland, we basically think that you need like a 60 centimeters width. For every person on board and so forth. So there's different kind of like principles that help and rules that help out to design the sauna.
So up on the screen, we've got some examples of different wood materials that can be used on the benching. There's quite a few examples of aspen up there, some spruce, some sauna ply. There's kello or deadwood spruce there as well. Do you have any preference over sort of over what types of wood are used on the benching from your experience?
Well, I personally choose for my own sauna. I choose untreated aspen, which is it's the lightest material, both in terms of weight and also in terms of color. Well, the untreated aspen is kind of it looks very nice when it's new. But the problem is that it gets signs of aging creep in very quickly, and it's very kind of sensitive. So you have to be able to try it out very quickly, or otherwise it'll get darker and gray and spots like that. It doesn't kind of
Mildew.
it doesn't kind of technically it's not damaged structurally.
Yeah,
it's kind of solid, but it still doesn't look the same. So I don't think I would recommend to anyone who's very sensitive about how the sauna looks like. But other than that, it's very nice material. I think I personally maybe like to draw the attention to the more fundamental question that can you actually make the sauna interior out of anything else but wood?
Right.
Because of course the wood, this kind of massive walls of wood have been the traditional choice in Finnish sauna industry for ages. And I think I'd say that 95% of, or at least all the Finnish saunas have been traditionally wood paneled one way or the other. Nowadays, more recently we've have seen the entrance of more like glass elements in saunas, which have like their drawbacks, so they're not ideal.
But I think lot of heat.
Yeah, but then again, there's been also the question that can you kind of create the sauna benches out of, for instance, this kind of ceramic tiles or materials, like they use in steam rooms.
Yeah, but wouldn't that get really hot?
Yeah, the issue is that it's not really kind of suitable material for sauna, even though it's basically very rot resistant and it's easy to clean. But the problem is that in order to kind of keep the sauna very hygienic, you need to achieve all the surfaces should be kind of or go above 55 degrees Celsius in order to kill the germs.
Yeah.
And already around like 40-45 degrees, this kind of non-wooden materials start to feel very hot. So actually, if you try to do, we have like in Finland a few public saunas which have we've actually had just a very like recently launched sauna which had basically ceramic benches or this type of material. And problem is that you have to cover them up, or alternatively, you have to install like a wooden
duckboard.
You have to cover them with duckboard, or then you have to install this kind of radiator or what is called water cooling system,
right?
So that it actually decreases the temperature. But that problem is that then it becomes like tolerable to sit on, but it becomes unhygienic.
Yeah.
So that's not something that I would recommend, because the other thing is that the bench structure also influences the circulation of air, and so it will probably influence somewhat what type of löyly you will get in the sauna, because the more kind of or the less the bench structures actually obstruct the flow of the air, the kind of more movement of the air from a löyly you will actually get.
Yeah, I've been to some sort of especially older Finnish houses in the countryside where they actually put like wooden benches, upper and lower, in a concrete room. And although the sauna itself takes a long time to heat up, it certainly seems possible to do it in that kind of setup. But it does have a different, like it's a lot more about the steam for the heat in those cases, because otherwise you've got such a large amount of thermal mass to heat up.
And I mean, if you have like there's one format and one manufacturer in Finland who creates this kind of underground sauna, so this kind of made out of concrete elements. And that kind of sauna it's impossible to get much to temperature around like 60 degrees is absolute maximum. It just takes forever to heat up any further. It's just impossible. But so this kind of now we're basically talking about the material for the walls. But it's kind of common that you see kind of matching materials being used for benches and walls. So yeah, but in overall, the influence of the material or the choice for the walls is not as big as it's for the benches. And I think the kind of second most important element that we that I consider for inside the sauna room is that is the construction and the design of the inner roof or
the ceiling.
Yes. So there we could have a look at there are a few simple illustrations of different types of roofs that we might have. And I think the basic idea is that we should not. Basic idea in the roof is that we should not construct a roof that allows the steam löyly to get outside of reach of the people in the sauna. So what we want to do is that we want to have the kind of design of the roof so that enables the steam to move around quite freely and reach the people. Because what will happen is that the steam will go to the highest location, it will go to the furthest location from the stove as quickly as possible. The steam doesn't actually move. In some locations, one sort of like funny thing is that it depends on the temperature of the sauna a little bit. That will you actually see the löyly coming out of the place. The colder your sauna is, and the more the hotter the stove is, the better chances you are actually seeing how the steam goes around in sauna. And the more hotter more hot it is, the less likely you're going to see anything. But if you see it actually does go like at a moderate speed, and then it spreads around in the sauna, going towards the kind of far end corner and to the highest peaks in the sauna. So you, for instance, if you for some reason would create this kind of like in the middle, there are like three alternatives in this illustration I've done. In the kind of worst case scenario, we would have this kind of somehow like a peak in the roof somewhere totally not anywhere close to the bathers, and that would kind of capture and trap all the steam inside of it, and it would be basically impossible to get any steam where you're sitting. So this kind of solutions which more or less direct the löyly towards the bathers are the kind of best ones, and this kind of rounded dome shape is I think the ultimate one, at least in my experience. But also even this kind of thing that has two folds is already like very good.
A very low twin pitch.
Twin
or
pitch.
a totally. What you don't have up there is the example of a completely flat, which obviously
that's the kind of most common one, of course.
So I guess with the more pitch ceilings, is there like a risk that the steam could sit up way above the user's head and kind of get stuck there? Particularly in example B, as you've rightly pointed out, you create a bit of a steam trap.
Yeah, I think my kind of illustrations were not. I'm kind of missing out the kind of most typical flat roof here, but I mean that's kind of still okay. But I think the kind of why these, for instance, the pitched versions are better. They also kind of block out these kind of corners where people really aren't, and kind of reducing the kind of volume of the sauna space that's still going to go unused. It's kind of a good idea. So yeah, I think the kind of biggest lesson is just to avoid these kind of evidently bad designs.
Yeah.
And make sure that your benches are properly close to the ceiling.
Okay.
But there are, of course, now we've basically gone through a few elements of the sauna room design. Of course, the sauna has, or the room has several elements that you have to have, like walls, windows, door, floor. All these things have some kind of an impact on the sauna experience. Maybe the one I could say that, for instance, the windows in Finland, most of people don't realize that the manufacturers actually know how to create windows that are appropriate for sauna, but if you don't know what to ask for, you're not going to get it automatically. Because, for instance, in Finland, people use these like triple glass windows, and sometimes they might be filled with gases that kind of start expanding heavily when you warm up, and they will break the glass. So you should definitely not get that kind of a windows to your sauna. Same thing goes with this kind of what is it called? Handle.
Gets red hot if it's metal.
Yeah, it's very easy to get one that's made out of wood, but you wouldn't get one if you don't know that you can get one.
Yeah,
because it doesn't definitely it's not the standard. So
we have the problem with people who say, "Oh yeah, I've got this space that I've put a window in, and it's like a UPVC window, and PVC like will just degrade at the temperature in the sauna so quickly."
Yeah, that's not really a good idea.
No.
Another kind of safety issues that I would always kind of people in Finland quite often use like different kind of wooden materials, particularly in this kind of more rustic saunas. I have no kind of nothing against doing like ceramic tiles or this kind of they're kind of robust material for sauna floor, but just make sure that the kind of material that you choose is not going to be awfully slippery.
Yeah,
because they have like different gratings, and you should definitely go.
Rating, the highest.
Yeah, you need to kind of go for that. Otherwise, you'll be
breaking your neck, falling over in the sauna. Yeah.
Particularly after you've got a few beers,
we can't condone drinking in the sauna.
No.
So in your book, you've mentioned you have 4 sections. We've talked about the more practical ones, and certainly your specialism is in the kind of the mechanics of it and the science behind it. But I guess that kind of brings us nicely on to section 4, which is a bit more sort of about the culture and perhaps some more esoteric aspects of.
Yeah, the sauna culture and habits and company are something that, I mean, you can't really have the sauna experience without actually spending time in the sauna, and that usually, even in Finland, happens in some kind of a company. Even if it's your family or friends or someone else, or in public sauna, God knows who. It's still something like a place where people come together and share some sort of moment and experience. And the way I see it, I mean, the whole idea of having some sort of sauna experience, you can't really design anyone's experience, but you can design the space that supports having some sort of experience. And I think that's been my kind of ideology from the start. And the way I see it is that we have like particular sauna habits and ways that Finnish people like to use their saunas, and that's different from like what Germans do or what the Russians do. But nowadays, when you think about this, like what sort of like sauna culture and what sort of habits you want to promote, I think it's important to take into consideration that maybe you could also consider, for instance, can the same sauna be used for different types of sauna habits or cultures. For instance, the whisking thing is something that I personally a little bit like miss. It has slightly disappeared from the Finnish saunas. My own guess is that it's because people nowadays have my private saunas and they have to clean them up.
Yeah,
and whisking creates more mess.
Many
leaves everywhere. Yeah, I'm still pulling the birch leaves out the back of my sauna from last season. So.
Yeah, because I think people forget in the correct way to prepare a birch vista, you soak them and then you blanch them on the stones. But obviously they're going to lose leaves, and when they get in the stones and you're pouring löyly or your water on the stones to produce löyly, it just washes all the leaves into the stones deeper and deeper, and then for about a week afterwards, you just smell burning birch leaves every time you light the sun.
Yeah, that's kind of that's one of the unfortunate outcomes of whisking. But I think for the kind of general maintenance of the sauna, you can kind of think about this: that how easy will this kind of solution, for instance, for sauna benches, is going to be clean. We have like locations which the cleaning hasn't been very high priority in design. And these kind of benches, for instance, are currently quite popular in Finland, which make it almost impossible to clean beneath them. So I think that should be kind of taken care of or taken into consideration if you want to make it possible to do whisking or if you want to do aufguss somewhere.
Yeah.
That you need to kind of think about it, how the sauna is going to be used, or could it be used somehow differently than it's being currently used. That's also a little bit like an accessibility thing. That what happens if you break your leg?
Yeah.
If you get small kids, how safe will this environment be? That's of course not kind of maybe not so much culture, but it's about kind of thinking about that. What kind of things will the sauna support in the future? Because I mean, it seems that people can come up with new ideas on how to use saunas, even in a quite short period of time. But saunas themselves are not that kind of maybe easy to transform once they've been initially designed. It's not kind of easy to extend the saunas to be bigger, or modifications in kind of larger scale aren't really that easy to happen. They're kind of easy to, you can kind of change the materials, the outlooks, but it's very difficult to kind of make very major changes if you just incorporated a sauna into a building. So I think it's good to think about how the sauna culture is going. For instance, in Finland, we still have like the people usually bathe in nude, and then we've had this kind of sex segregation, which basically assume that in a lot of the public places people go nude and with the same sex. And then again, we've got some like public saunas such as Löyly Helsinki, in which people go. The saunas are shared, but people wear swimming suits. That's apparently like one trend we've had in the past years, and might be getting more popular. The fact, the good part of that is that if we can have like if the members of the opposite sex can share the same spaces, we don't have to make that many similar, identical saunas and other spaces. It's better. We can have more variety, and people can have more company. So that's like a positive thing. Then on the other hand, using the swimming suits that's like unfortunately, you kind of shielding yourself away from the actual steam, for instance, and löyly. So I'm not kind of big fan of that. But it's interesting to see how things go, because we have, of course, the society is changing. We've like these kind of same-sex marriages became legal in Finland a few years back, and then becomes this kind of questions that how we actually deal with these more complicated things, for instance, like the third gender, or people who don't kind of associate themselves with either biological sex and so forth.
Yeah.
And nowadays we actually have in Finland, we have one like public swimming hall in Helsinki, which has like officially they call family room, but it's also kind of a room for the people who are not kind of willing to go anywhere in nude.
Yes.
Because of their own thinking. But so these are kind of, I think, themes that go around like the culture and what we expect out of the sauna, and how these things evolve over time.
Yeah, I mean, this is nothing new to us. So in the UK, like any public sauna, you have to wear a swimming costume, and certainly there's a lot of like fear, particularly of having young people in the sauna as well. So they'll often say no children under 16 and things like that. But I mean, that's a different issue entirely. I think that's more a case of UK health and safety law combined with sort of these kind of places having an association with a place for adults to spend time. So not really wanting to invite children in, but that has left a culture of people associating the sauna as somewhere that's dangerous for children, which if you spend any time in Finland, it's not true.
It's very different. I think same thing is like in Germany, it's most like adults only.
Yeah.
Whereas I've just last week, my son is soon turning 2 years, and he was with me in a sauna, and he was very keen on pouring as much water on the stove as he can. His favorite hobby at the time being.
Yeah.
So, but there's a lot of this kind of cultural things that you need to take into consideration in creating a space that kind of allows for different kind of culture to emerge and be practiced.
That's all covered in your book, which is coming out. I know you said you wouldn't make any promises, but hopefully this year.
I'd say if we are lucky and realistic, I think we could see an English edition of the book coming up in about a year.
Okay, great.
But there's still some work to be done on that regard. I'm kind of now very much looking forward to have the Finnish version of the secret of the Finnish sauna design coming up just before midsummer.
Fantastic.
And tell me, you've obviously dedicated a lot of time trying to discover the secret to Finnish sauna design. Do you feel like, we spoke at the start with the sauna that you had in your summer cottage and renovating that. Did you find the secret to sauna design, or you kind of got this Sisyphus complex where it's just
it's the holy
never-ending pursuit?
It's all about the journey and not about the destination.
Well, yeah, I definitely would like to build another sauna. But I'd say that I've found a lot of things on the way. For instance, I've discovered why the old sauna was such a bad instance of sauna, and I actually managed to improve that.
Yeah.
Although I'm still not using it anymore. But I think there are it's like plural things. So there are actually several secrets. And as I've been explaining here, it's kind of complicated combination of different kind of solutions that must go together nicely, and there's no kind of single way to achieve the perfect Finnish sauna experiences. But instead, whenever you're building one, you have to take into consideration quite a big number of variables and then make your choice on that.
So before we finish up here, is there a particular public sauna in Finland that you really love? That's next time we're in Finland that we should try out.
Well, I mean, there are a lot of very nice public saunas in Helsinki area, but I think I would recommend anyone who comes to visit Helsinki in the greater Helsinki area at Vantaa city. You'll find around 30 minutes from downtown Helsinki, the Kuusijärvi side, which has the original smoke saunas for public use. It opens up in the afternoon, and it's pretty unique. I don't think you can find that kind of thing anywhere else in the world, so I definitely go there.
Yeah, brilliant. Nice. Well, thank you so much for coming onto our inaugural podcast, Al. It's been a real pleasure having you here. And to those of you listening, if you speak Finnish, then definitely pounce on his book when it comes out later this year. And if you speak English, like us, you're just going to have to wait a year.
Yeah, be patient.
Remember to like, subscribe, you press the little bell button if you're listening to this on YouTube, so that you can keep up to date with all our podcasts as they come out. We've got a great lineup of amazing guests coming up. And once again, thank you so much for your time, Al.
Thank you.
Great to meet you.
Thanks, guys. It was a pleasure.
Cheers. Thank you.